Throughout the course of the past 2 days, we've talked about, and other speakers have talked about theory. We have case studies, so we know what's actually on the market, and we have lovely displays and art outside. But even at the conclusion of this conference, we still don't really have like what's a wide use case for AR. Like, we enjoy AR, but how do we get the wide consumer base to actually enjoy AR as well? So that's what I'll be talking about. So this is just a background, because it's like, why is this girl up here on the stage? Like, how is she qualified to be up here on the stage? And so the reason why I got into augmented and virtual reality is because of my different backgrounds. So I did my bachelor's at Columbia, and I studied physics and math. And the reason why I was attracted to physics and math is because I wanted to just know, how do things work? Like, why do things work? Like, I started out with chemistry, and then eventually I'm like, but why do molecules do that? And eventually it trickled down to physics was the answer to most things. And the reason why we don't know the answer to most things is because no one understands thermodynamics still. And in terms of like how to make, I also received a degree in electrical engineering and computer science. And in terms of design, I was very fortunate enough to work with some of those people that you see right there. And so the first, let me see this. So the first guy right here, he was my favorite professor at Columbia, and one thing he always told us, he was an engineering professor, and he would always tell us, engineers, we're so arrogant, but it all comes back to economics. Everything's economics, never forget that. And one thing he would also say is that the Newton quote, which is, if I have seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And these 6 influencers are the giants that have brought me to where I am today. So again, I was very fortunate enough to work with Don Norman and Scott Clemmer in the design lab. So I did my master's with them in the design lab. And I actually TA'd for Scott Clemmer's course. And then Benjamin Bratton is a very world-renowned person in the field of speculative design. And he actually founded a major called Speculative Design. And this woman right here is my inspiration. Her name's Timony West, and I will be working under her at Unity in June. And so and that's also Lev Manovic, who's a very famous media arts researcher. And so this is obviously speculative, so I don't know how many of you have seen the recent Blade Runner, but a lot of my presentation will be in purple and pink, and I'll explain why later. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what actually is reality? Because until you can answer that question, you don't really understand the use cases for augmented reality. And so this is an example. This is probably one of the only examples I've been able to interact with. So this was actually my mentor, my internship last summer at PlayStation. And so this was an augmented virtuality experience, which was called Believable Characters. And so the distinction between augmented virtuality and augmented reality is that I'm actually wearing a VR headset, but then I'm able to interact with things in the real world, and those appear in virtual space. And so I'm going to explain the differences, which we know. So there's the virtual reality continuum, which was founded by Paul Milgram in the early 1990s. And so we have the 4 different distinctions. We're obviously primarily concerned with this distinction. So how do we take the real environment and overlay data on top of that environment to augment the real world? So we're not as concerned with the real environment and the virtual environment, but I'll actually make a very clear correlation between the real environment and the virtual environment later in the talk. Okay, and so when we think of reality, we think of how do we perceive. So again, there's the famous conundrum, if a tree falls in the forest, and you don't see it, is it actually there? And so there's a lot of epistemology, and there's a lot of philosophy that concerns perception. But I think that the work that undergoes perception is overlooked in terms of virtual and augmented reality. I think that's very important to distinguish what is perception and how do we use that to then make applications that are widespread. And so we have a lot of senses. People mainly think, oh, we have sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste. There are many senses, many senses. And I know that if you have a lot of these senses actually end up becoming apparent when you're playing games, especially virtual reality games, because a lot of the physical sicknesses that arise from that are because we don't fully understand balance, acceleration, proprioception. And so proprioception is I know where I am at a given time in a given moment. So it's a sense of self, like a kinesthetic sense of self, and temperature and pain. And so an example of, like the best example of perception is light. And so, yeah, I'm a physicist, so I like light. And so we know that the visible light spectrum goes from like 400 to 700 nanometers, and that's what we can see. And so when we look at a rainbow, we look at a reflection on a prism, we see the visible light spectrum. But the thing is, you notice that like there are certain colors that aren't in the visible light spectrum. And so actually colors like fuchsias and pinks and purples, our mind actually perceives those colors because our mind fills in a gap between red and violet, because again, we can't actually perceive, like the brain somehow like makes a sort of interpolation between the two colors. And so that kind of shows that like what we perceive like might actually not be there, and I think that's quite important. So what this is basically saying is that the virtual reality environment that we think of, to me, and maybe not to you, it's not really different than the actual real environment, and I'll explain why. Because if you perceive something, if you perceive something in the virtual environment and you perceive something in the real environment, we have our biases, we use our senses to perceive the actual environment. So in reality, like the virtual environment and the real environment, it's more of a nominalist thing of whether or not there's a distinction. And that's why augmented reality is important, because augmented reality is what can heighten the distinction between like our biases and our environment. And so I think the important thing to take away from augmented reality is not like what do we perceive, like what do I see, it's what do I know? And I think that that's what needs to be answered in addressing problems with augmented reality. So what are commonalities that we have? And so the commonalities that the market has, we have consumerism, perceptual psychology, and design. So what are consumers actually gonna buy? Like, what are most people gonna buy? Like, I might wanna buy, what do I want right now? I might want a surfboard right now, right? But I don't know if anyone else wants a surfboard because I don't really know the Boston surfing scene at all. In terms of design, like, how do we create a plan to construct an object, and how do we iterate through that process? And perception, which again is like, how do we use our senses to actually interpret and interact? And again, some people don't have like full grasp of all of their senses, and like, some of us are like faulty in some and not in others. So like, how do we sort of gauge like how different senses interact? And so I put this Snapchat ghost here because I think, as a millennial, that Snapchat is probably the best use case of AR, and it's the most widely used use case of AR, because we've all seen Pokemon Go, and people used it for the first 4 months. People almost got run over because they were looking for Mewtwo, but then after that, like, it kind of dissipated in a way, and I know that Niantic is coming out with another Pokemon Go update, but Snapchat has actually remained in the game because it's resilient. And what Snapchat does is Snapchat asks the questions like, when we think that Snapchat's gonna fail, because every time someone sort of like siphons Snapchat's idea, then somehow they emerge with something new, like we're gonna stop putting in ads, we're gonna start adding these filters. And so Snapchat's a very resilient company, and I think part of that is because it's actually founded by millennials, but then I'm gonna get into the next slide and say why a lot of times millennials don't actually have all the answers and why sometimes it's problematic. And so the thing is, in modern times, I think that engineers have forgotten the IEEE Code of Ethics. There's also an ACM Code of Ethics. There's a lot of different organizational ethics. But the thing is, I think that we've forgotten this. And so the first ethical rule is to act in the public interest. And let's be honest, we enjoy tinkering. We don't really act in the public interest as much as we should. And so we need to act in the interest of clients and employers. A lot of times, again, a lot of it's self-directed and ego-driven, and I think that in order to progress forward, that is, if you want an application that goes to market, you have to think outside yourself and your perception and think, what can I market that actually hits other people as well? And so the future will actually belong to augmented reality when it actually improves some sort of task, like the efficiency of task and the quality of the user's experience. That's basically the niche market for AR. That's what'll bring it, put it on the map, is once we can achieve that. And so I know everyone's seen Harrison Ford at least once this conference, but I had to show him again. And so there's the Got Milk commercial, and you're like, why would you bring up milk? That doesn't make sense. But you'll see why soon. So there's the obligatory Harrison Ford. And so the thing is, the reason why I use Got Milk is because there's a paper by Donald Schoen, who's a cognitive science researcher, that's called Pasteur's quadrant. And why does this matter? Pasteur's quadrant matters because, as I said earlier, we're stuck right here. We're stuck at tinkering. But the thing is, the best research, it's actually relevant for immediate application, but then it's also relevant for generalized knowledge. So in the paper, they explain that pure basic research is Niels Bohr, so like, physics, the Bohr atom, and that pure applied research is something like Edison. And again, of course, the Bohr atom is extremely important, and of course, Edison's work is important, but Pasteur, when he approached the problem, he approached it like we need to sanitize our food source, but then he also needed to look at it from a source of generalized knowledge. And so the big problem is that 70% of Americans don't even know what augmented reality is. So yesterday I asked my parent, what's augmented reality? And their response was, oh, it's that thing that overlays something on top of something and it distorts it. I was like, that's really bad. I was like, I don't think that it should be distorting anything. I think it should be just it should be overlaying information. Sometimes it could distort something, but the sort of negative connotation attached with that, it breaks away from a person's reality, I don't think is something that we should think about in terms of market applications. And so I called it object-oriented thinking because if you're a programmer, you know that a lot of languages are obviously object-oriented. So we have something, we classify we put attributes based, we assign attributes to an object. And the thing is, I feel like when it comes to augmented reality, we really like assigning attributes and we really like assigning value to people and not objects. And we already know that's not good to assign value to people and not objects. So I think that we need to actually assign value to objects and not ourselves when we're looking at augmented reality. And so this is an example of augmented reality gone awry. It's the Black Mirror episode. The nosedive episode where everyone has a rating out of 5 and people go crazy to get a rating. If you have a rating lower than a 4, well, there's a lot of stuff that's not accessible to you. And I think that this was a very good episode because it shows you that we shouldn't really be placing value on people with these technologies. We should use it to as communal activities or to make our lives easier, not as judgment mechanisms. And again, we already kind of have this because again, after I saw this episode, the first thing I did was I checked my Uber rating. It wasn't as good as I thought it was. And I really don't know why, but that's just another issue. And so again, this is when she goes crazy. So I mean. And so this is the design process, and a lot of people skip the first step. But the thing is, so we define, we ideate, we prototype, and we test, and then we just repeat it over and over and over again until we get a solution that a sizable number of users would like. However, we keep forgetting the empathize. And the thing is, the empathize is actually the most important thing because, again, having been in the design lab with Scott Clemmer and Don Norman, and I didn't reference it, but again, Don Norman's the wonderful gentleman who wrote The Design of Everyday Things. The first thing you do when you study with him is he says everything's about the user. It's always about what do users want, need finding. He never asks what do you want, Jasmine, what do you want personally? It's what do users need. And actually, Don Norman's very interested in augmented reality and virtual reality, so that was another push because it's if the father of design is interested in this space and he sees a need for it, then there's great potential. But I think the potential is stifled because a lot of the applications that we make aren't empathetic. And so you might say, what does this quote even mean? But I'll explain. So when I say don't design products only you can use, but then don't design products you can't use. So you might really like cats and augmented reality and say, let me make that app. And to be fair, that would probably sell. that would sell. But the thing is, but then also a lot of us, even though this is a very, very important application of AR, it always gets mentioned as like the only one, where I actually am surprised that no one has like any other example of it, which is like medical AR. So medical AR is very, very, very important, but a lot of times the people making the apps, making the medical apps, they can't use them because again, you need to be certified. There's a bunch of laws that you need in place. You have to go through the decades of schooling to even get to be an MD to use that on patients. So we're either making products and we're tinkering and we're making things that only we like, or we're making something that we ourselves can't even use. And so there's a middle ground. And so examples of like what to do. Okay, so I had to put some sort of like ridiculous physics thing in here. And so this is, again, is like assigning value to objects. So this picture was because one day I was gonna go cliff diving. I didn't actually go cliff diving, but one day I was gonna go cliff diving. And the reason why I didn't go cliff diving is because I called my mom and I said, Mom, I think I'm gonna go cliff diving. And then she's like, if that's the case, I'm just gonna call New York Life. And I was like, what does that even mean? So I was like, okay. So then I was like, is it a good idea for me to cliff dive? And so then I like assessed it and I looked at how high it was. And I was like, I don't think it's a good idea for me to cliff dive. And then I like researched the thing. And I remember I got to like the edge of it, and the guy that I was going with to cliff dive, he was an ex-Navy SEAL. So, I mean, he's done worse. So I just looked down, and I'm just like, I don't think I can jump, Matt. Like, I really don't think I can jump. And I really wish I had a pair of augmented reality glasses with me at the time to basically say, like, you're gonna hit the water like at like probably like 55 miles per hour, and you know, that's like maybe like 2 G-forces. You might not survive. But I didn't really need that because I just thought of like, well, if my mom was gonna increase my life insurance, then I probably shouldn't cliff dive. And so one good use case of this is what NASA does to do repairs. So if you're not aware, NASA uses the HoloLens to do in-ship repairs because that's all they really have available, so that's a very good use case. But you can also apply this to this. So I don't know if you guys know what this is, if anybody can guess, but it starts with an I and ends with a Kia, because to me that looks terrible. To me that looks terrible, but to some people like it. But the thing is, that's what it makes me do when I look at IKEA, because what IKEA is to me is it's a mechanical engineer litmus test. And so I'm not a mechanical engineer, and I know that because I can't put together IKEA products. But like one example that you could do is you take the NASA template and use that to then facilitate like the way that people put things together and like to have an augmented reality instruction manual. And so another issue is a lot of people are always worried about like dieting, dating, what have you. And so like if you've seen Mean Girls, again, you know, some people might have the question, is butter a carb? I mean, I don't know many people that had that question, but some people might. And so like an example, which again, someone needs to make this, so cough, cough, someone should make it, is that there's a lot of allergies and a lot of Californians on very like exotic diets. So the thing is, like, you know, this is an all-carb diet, but we can apply this to people that have, say that someone has celiacs, someone's on a keto diet, someone can't, you know, someone's lactose intolerant. You should be able, even on a phone, we don't have like our nice headset yet, but even on a phone, I should be able to identify via UPC number, like, should I actually have access, like should I take that object? Because say I only have like X amount of money in my bank account, but then I'm shopping out in Whole Foods, and basically it's like, should I really actually be buying this? And so I think that like that's another use case of augmented reality, because we all have to eat, and if you don't, please tell me how, because I need to study more. But, and this can easily be integrated with like Siri, Alexa, or Cortana, because you could just ask, hey Siri, like, is butter a carb? And then Siri might have something snarky to say. I haven't really tried that, but you can test that out. And so there's a lot of other examples to give, but I think that like thinking about commonalities like food, just like modern uses, I mean, even like event planning is a good starting point and a good launch point to actually assessing like what can we do in this field to like make it accessible to everyone. And so again, we need to stop, the whole point is we need to stop thinking about ourselves, because again, like some of us see pink and purple, some of us are colorblind, some of us can't see pink and purple. A lot of us embed our biases into our devices, and I think that that's inevitable. Like we're inevitably going to embed what we think into what we make, but we also need to be aware of that, like according to the IEEE Code of Ethics. And then I think that once we understand that, then augmented reality will really take off. So, and then that's my contact information. That's it.